Today we're talking about the ruthless elimination of hurry. We live in a digital age with more information, resources and opportunity at our fingertips than previous generations could ever have dreamed of. And yet, by almost all measures, Western society seems to be producing more tired, more stressed, more anxious, more depressed people than ever before. So what's gone wrong? How do we fix it? John Mark Comer is one of my guests on today's show. He's the pastor of Bridgetown Church in Portland, Oregon. He co-hosts the podcast This Cultural Moment with Mark Sayers, and he's the author of several books. His latest is called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, and it examines the hurry-sick, anxiety-prone, tech-addicted nature of modern culture. And drawing on his own experience of finding a new way of living, he invites those who are unsatisfied with their life to get off the treadmill and rediscover the way of Jesus. Well, Rachel Holmes is my other guest. Rachel was a participant over 7 years ago, I can hardly believe it's this long, in our atheist prayer experiment here on Unbelievable, where around 70 or 80 atheists took the challenge to pray daily for God to reveal himself to them over a course of 40 days. Now, if you want to go and revisit that, it's somewhere back in the archives, I think November 2012. But Rachel grew up in a Christian household but lost her faith, and she might sort of tell us a little bit about that again today, and has been quite open on her blog about struggling at times with depression and illness. But she's here really today to engage with John Mark on this modern malaise of hurry and anxiety, and what, as a non-believer, how she's sought to find peace and what she makes of his suggestions for a healthy life. So it's a great pleasure to have you both, John Mark here in studio and Rachel on the line as well. Thanks both for being with me today on the programme. Before we come to Rachel, John Mark, someone who hasn't been on this show before, but I feel like we kind of know each other a bit.
I know. I'm a long-time listener, so
I know.
I'm really happy to be here.
I was so thrilled when I discovered that a few years ago, that you have been a listener to Unbelievable.
Oh, I love it. You know, a podcast like this would never fly in America. It's too rational and reasonable and non-polarized.
That's very kind. That's very kind. But
I love it.
We seem to have a lot of listeners as well in the Portland area, I have to say, which is obviously where you're a pastor. And we, of course, went out in 2018, did an Unbelievable conference at Westside Jesus, where I think you were the pastor at one time before.
Many years ago. Yeah, we planted out of there. Yeah.
So there's lots of connections. But it's lovely to have you in studio. And when I saw that you had this book come out and you might be in the UK to do some talking about it, I thought, it's not the normal kind of thing would feature on Unbelievable, let me be honest, but I really want John Mark Comer to come on the show. So this was my excuse.
This was your excuse. And poor Rachel, I feel like I owe you an apology and we haven't even started.
No. Well, Rachel, let's just introduce you as well briefly before we hear about the book from John Mark. Can you believe that over 7 years ago that you were on the Atheist Prayer Experiment?
I know, yes, it was towards the end of 2012. I do remember that. And it was a very interesting experience for me. I know I had some experiences during the experiment, which I think probably some of your listeners and maybe even you thought, yes, that was God, you stupid woman. Why did you not recognize that? But I'm not sure how you'll feel about this, Justin, but that experiment set up by you was kind of instrumental in me becoming a Buddhist.
Really? So I didn't know that bit of the story. Wow.
Oh,
okay.
Well, I'd say I'm secular Buddhist. I'm not, I'm very, very unconvinced about things like rebirth, and the more far-reaching implications of karma just seem to be plain old victim blaming to me. But Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path. But it did change my life. So even though I didn't become a believer, it did change my life. And part of it was very much what I appreciated about the slowing down in the morning, just to have that prayer for God to reveal himself to me, and then a time of just sitting and waiting. So it kind of ties in with John Mark's book and his ideas.
Well, that's really interesting, and I'd love to talk a bit about that in the course of today's programme. I mean, just for the benefit of those who can't recall or haven't listened to that Atheist Prayer Experiment set of programmes we did, I remember at the time you basically said that at least once when you were praying, a voice came to you and said, do you want me to help you with your sadness? And that you felt a thought, as you called it, dropping into my head of, well, be thankful. And as you say, I think a lot of people would have said, oh, well, if you want God talking to you, that's a pretty good example of God talking to you. But you didn't feel you had to interpret it in that kind of way.
I didn't. I was, and I guess I still am, open to the possibility that it was. But I think also when you get quiet, you can tap into a deeper wisdom and I felt it was more likely that it was that. But I won't completely discount the possibility that it was God. But I understand those of your listeners who might have thought, duh.
Well, look, we'll get to some more of sort of how that has manifested in your life, what some of the challenges are that you face, and how you see your own sort of spiritual practices, as it were, helping in that. John Mark, if we come back to the book, and I have to say, I've been reading it, and my wife as well, and we've both found it incredibly helpful, very challenging as well, because it's quite a drastic kind of call to essentially live very differently to the way our technologically driven, fast-paced culture kind of demands of us, isn't it?
Yeah, against the inertia of culture right now.
Exactly. And this is something, though, that you're writing from personal experience, because you this book is the result of you deciding something's got to change because my life is unlivable as it stands. Do you want to tell us about what caused that?
Oh, I mean, honestly, and we could talk for way too long. I'm not sure that's the best use of our time, but it's the common kind of trope of the early midlife crisis in the Western world. I live in a city, demanding job. I'm, the first generation really to come into the phone as this new, as one person I chatted to recently called it, the human experiment in omnipresence, which, we're just 12 years into. I read another person recently who was saying, people talk about the fear of the cyborg or whatever, and functionally, we're cyborgs already. You know what I mean? We just haven't. Elon Musk is trying to get it into our brain, but we already are.
It's not physically attached, but you could be forgiven for thinking some people are almost physically attached.
Yeah,
to
or
their
is
phone.
it? I'm not sure. So I'm happy to go down that rabbit trail if you want. But I hit a spot about 7 years ago where it was a profound kind of both mental emotional crisis. I have a history of mental illness in my family, and when I was younger, in university, a real clear brush with anxiety and depression, and a really dark morass a number of years of my life where I was really on the verge of something dangerous. And so that's all in my kind of neurophysiology and my genetic code and my life experience. And then you compound onto that just the stress of life and work, and then you add in the phone, and then you give a few years for adulthood to just pile over on one to another. And really hit a profound place of mental, emotional burnout, fatigue, exhaustion. And then below it, really even kind of a deeper spiritual crisis in my own, what as a follower of Jesus I would call spiritual formation, in my own process of becoming more like Jesus, and in doing so, I pray more like kind of my own true self. And I really felt that I was stuck, that I had hit a wall and was really just kind of banging my head against it, and definitely not progressing, and maybe even regressing under all of the stress. And so it was a real profound kind of early midlife crisis where the gift of those moments is you kind of put everything on the table, and you're open to new possibilities that you weren't before. And you just kind of set everything down, work and job and God and all of these things. You set before you, and and there's a beautiful freedom that comes when you can just kind
That's
of
interesting.
reimagine.
Yeah. So you kind of basically put everything up for grab and said, what if this isn't the life that feels like a Jesus-centered life. It's not the life Jesus lived. Jesus was a busy person, though. It's not like he didn't have much to do and could just sit around. But at the same time, you were aware that he didn't move from a place of stress and anxiety and the rush. It was always something that came from a different place.
Yeah, so when I use the moniker of hurry, that's just that means different things to different people. But even the word busyness is, you have to interpret all of this. And so there's a healthy kind of busyness that just means you have a lot to do. Your life is generative. You're not wasting your life, playing video games till 2 a.m. or on social media all the time, or Candy Crush. Like, you're doing something generative and creative and life-giving and beautiful. But then there's another type of busyness that's far more common and I think toxic, what Ron Rolheiser, who's a Catholic writer I love, he calls it pathological busyness. As in, it's like a pathogen, loose in our society and our soul.
Well, it's the way everyone answers now to how are you?
Busy. It's what everybody says.
It's like the standard answer.
It's the customary Western answer.
And if you weren't busy, something would be wrong. You'd be lazy.
Because it's a moniker. It means I'm important. It means I matter. And part of that goes back to the deeper structures of Western culture, which is built around accomplishment and accumulation.
Sure.
And And so who are you if you're not doing something in the world? Your identity is at stake, So I'm busy, and followed by the next question, what do you do? Fill in, career, vocation. And of course I care about work and generativity, but that other kind of busyness is when you have not a lot to do, but too much to do. And so the only way to fit it all in is to hurry, to speed up your mind and your body. And what really matters for me is your relationships and your interactions with God and with other people to a pace that is incompatible with love and with joy and with peace, which in Christian theology are kind of the trifecta of life.
And to what extent do you link, the way that that's accelerated in a way in the iPhone age? I think there are even statistics showing the spike in depression and even suicide and so on young people kind of correlates with the introduction of smartphones.
Oh yeah, my understanding is that's pretty much agreed upon. Yeah, it's not a question.
And so what's happening there? If we can say it's not just a correlation, there's a causation here. Is there something about us being constantly available to these devices that is doing something to our soul, essentially?
Yeah, and that's where you'd want to have a neuroscientist on, not a pastor. But yeah, everything I've read has said yes, absolutely. There's no question the link between the phone and anxiety, but it's deeper than just the blue screen or addiction. And, because it was a problem before the phone. Yeah. And so, recently I've been thinking a lot about Edwin Freeman's book, Failure of Nerve. He's the one that coined the phrase a non-anxious presence, and his kind of portrait of the West and its regression into at a moral and a relational level. I'm sorry, at an emotional and a relational level. To a culture of anxiety in spite of the myth of progress, and that was written in 1997,
right?
And he's writing
things
about
have changed quite a lot. Since
then.
And
gosh, that's a decade before the smartphone. So I think you are already at a tipping point in Western culture of anxiety for all sorts of reasons, from urbanization to the breakdown of the family to secularism. And then I think the phone just exacerbated a vulnerability in the human condition, which is what the early founders of Facebook attempted to do.
Yes, I think that was their whole thing, was how can we make people stay on their devices for as long as they possibly can and earn us the most amount of money?
There's a quote in...
It's not an accident,
It's not an accident, no. It's billions upon billions of dollars. Economists call it the attention economy. They make money off of our anxiety and our addiction.
Well, we're going to talk about some of the steps, some of them quite drastic in a way, at least for modern people, to the way you've at least decided to change the way you live life with your family, and your recommendations in the book for others. Rachel, coming back to you, tell us about sort of your response to the book overall. You've only had a chance to just read it quite quickly, which is ironic, obviously, given it's a book about
the irony, Rachel. I'm so sorry.
I know.
That's my fault for not giving you much notice. But do you kind of agree with the diagnosis, let's say, that John Mark has in this book about culture currently?
Yes, I do think we are far too hurried. And that it is causing a great deal of malaise. There was much in the book. I tried to focus on what I agreed with because I thought it would make for a more pleasant and productive conversation. But in general, I can endorse the overall message, even if not being a Christian, I'm not on board with the fundamental sort of Jesus part of it. But yes, to slow down, to take time, that hurrying is incompatible with a deeper appreciation of life, of being present to the people we say we love. That's all rang absolutely true. I found myself laughing with how much I identified with some of the things you said, John Mark.
I'm sorry, / you're welcome.
What were some of the things you identified with then, Rachel?
Oh, with just the constant hurrying and trying to multitask, and how impossible that is because you just end up doing everything badly. The constant sense of anxiety and feeling like you want to run on to the next thing instead of being fully there for the thing you're doing. There was a lot that I identified with. And funny, as it came to me, I thought, I know there's a quote that I want to get. And this was Blaise Pascal: all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. And that was in the 1600s. Imagine how appalled he'd be if he was out back here now.
I know.
So,
where you sit alone on our phones and catch up on Instagram.
Exactly.
I know.
This is one of the things, and I was having this thought before I read it in your book, but your book sort of confirmed it for me, that as Christians, I think we pray less because we have phones in our pockets. So every moment that you're in a queue, walking down the road, whatever, oh, phone comes out,
Yeah.
check. It becomes your instinctive. Whereas we might have used that opportunity to pray and so on. And this is where it's changed me. I've consciously made the decision. I'm not going to get my phone out on the train. Let's try and do something
because
that we
those
used to do
moments
here.
really matter, and they've all been swallowed up now by the digital carnivore.
And I'm going to ask you to be kind of frank here, Rachel. But what's your relationship with your iPhone or whatever form of technology you use?
I wouldn't say I am addicted. I think, like probably most people are. I don't tend to get it out on the train unless I'm listening to something rather than going online. But that's still a distraction.
Sure.
But I think probably with the practices I have done, the Buddhist practices, I know that some of the greatest joys I've had on public transport is sitting on a packed tube carriage doing what's known as loving kindness meditation for the other people in the carriage, where you sort of breathe in and then breathe out is, may you be happy, may you be well, may you be free from suffering. And it's just much more wholesome, but that doesn't stop me getting the phone out sometimes and going onto Twitter, which is very toxic.
Well, it can be. I mean, these sort of social media platforms, like it or not, are set up to kind of draw you in and waste, inordinate lengths of time arguing with people you'd probably never met or really have any relationship with. But,
exactly.
But I mean, and I asked the question of you. I would freely admit to a kind of low level addiction that I'm only now, I think, getting to grips with, because I think a lot of us, it's crept up on us, this smartphone revolution, hasn't it, John Mark? It's not something we were prepared for, and I think people,
and there was
only
no
now,
societal-wide conversation about whether or not it's smart or intelligent way to live or sustainable, or just because there's an agenda with it to make money off of us. Now it's really interesting to hear about, obviously, where you've got to yourself, Rachel, in terms of the things that you're finding helpful. Just was fascinated just by that example you gave of the what did you call it? The kindness.
It's loving kindness meditation.
Meditation.
It's one Buddhist practice, and I don't do it nearly as much as I know would be good for me. But it's a way of cultivating friendliness and goodwill, and you can do it anywhere.
And so, is that something? I mean, given that I'm assuming you don't believe that having that does necessarily sort of supernaturally affect the other people around you. Is it just more for you rather than for them ultimately? What's the connection? I suppose?
It's to cultivate a feeling of openness and warmness towards other people. It's part of a number of practices where you can cultivate also compassion and what's known as sympathetic joy, where you feel delighted in other people's joys. But no, they are about cultivating wholesome qualities within yourself, and they will, of course, spread out into the world. If they're blooming in you, they will show in your behaviour.
Again, feel free to share as much or as little as you want, but I know that you've been fairly open about your own struggles with depression points, and you've come through some pretty major medical and health issues as well in the last year or two. So you had cancer, and that how did you deal with that? Were some of these meditation practices and so on something that helped as you were going through chemotherapy and everything else that was involved in that process?
They did. I mean, it wasn't my first brush with serious illness. So I've had 3 kidney transplants. Let's forget life insurance. No one will touch me. But yes, I found they did help, because I could. I mean, not all the time. I'm only human. But some of the time, I could be with my pain and my fear without being absolutely sucked under by it. And I think that's something I've learned through meditation. Here are these feelings. I can give them a cuddle. I don't have to be drowned by them.
Yeah, let them pass through. Rachel, do you find that in this area, and I'm so sorry to hear about your cancer.
It's okay. It's clear now. It's gone.
Yeah, oh, gosh, what a gift. Do you find that in this area of kind of some of the practices, the mindfulness, the slowing, do you find, with your background in Christianity or whatever you want to call it, do you find a lot of crossover and common ground between some of the practices of Jesus and some of the practices, such as that beautiful one, which I'm a fan of, I love it, or how do you experience that?
There is a lot of crossover. It's funny, while I was reading your book, I was thinking, oh gosh, this reminds me of a book I read in the 80s. What was it? And there you named it. About a few pages later, it was Celebration of Discipline.
Oh, wow.
Because I did use that book some of the time when I was still a Christian. And yes, of course, there is a lot that was in there that there's a lot of crossover. I mean, I'm sure from your perspective, it's fundamentally different because it's not Christ-centered. But there is nevertheless a lot of the things about, slow down, breathe, appreciate, and
compassion,
and simplify. And yes, exactly. So there is, as I say, I guess from your perspective, it is fundamentally different because God's not in it.
Yes.
But from my perspective, there is a lot of commonality in that you are trying to be with what is at a deeper level, and pay attention.
There's a Quaker writer from a century ago named Douglas Steere, who recently, I was reading some of his work, and he defined prayer as to pay attention to the deepest thing I know. And
that's really interesting.
I love that way of thinking about prayer. And yes, I mean, I think there's a fundamental difference in that, for me as a follower of Jesus, prayer is first and foremost a relational experience. And, obviously in the Buddhist tradition, it's different. But there is that same attempt to be fully present to the here and to the now and to the deepest thing I know, and the experience of how does that engender compassion and wisdom in us,
Yes. So, I do find there's crossover. And have you read any Anthony de Mello? I haven't, but I understand he writes a lot about awareness from a Christian perspective.
No, I was thinking of the novelist Don DeLillo. No, I've not.
No,
I was thinking 0K? I don't remember anything about Christian practice in that at all. It was very prescient Western... Yeah.
And you're a guy who
DeLillo I ever read just made me scared about landfill.
Yeah.
What it was called. Underworld, that was it.
I mean, just to come back to the issue of spiritual practices, because this is kind of having set out the problem, if you like, John Mark, in this book. You do then sort of give the way that you think Christians need to approach this, and it's about getting back to the way of Jesus, not simply believing in Jesus or the doctrines of Christianity, but there's a way of life that Jesus modeled. And when we read the Gospels, we're not just reading his teachings, we're seeing something modeled for us.
Yeah, that's why most of the Gospels are stories.
Right, exactly. And so what does that look like in your life? What changes did you make? And are you advocating that if people want to get serious about living this Jesus way of life, that they should make? And then we'll compare and contrast that with some of what Rachel's been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think I grew up in a church tradition where there was much more emphasis put on belief, and belief as defined by kind of the Western psyche, than there was on lifestyle, and nobody would have said that doesn't matter, but the emphasis was more on Bible and theology and ethical, kind of stuff. So it's what to think and what to believe and what to do or not to do, all of which it matters, but I think that has to come out of a lifestyle that's built around the pursuit of, for me, a relationship with the Trinitarian community of love that we call God. And so a core idea that I pick up when I'm reading the Gospels is, the Gospel writers use this Greek word hodos, which is translated way or road or path, which is interesting, very similar language to the Buddha used. And it's a word picture for kind of a way of life, a road or a path that you follow to move you forward toward what we would call the good life in Western culture, what Jesus called life in the kingdom of God. And so that's a really key idea for me that I think we've lost in the Western church since the Reformation, that the way of Jesus is not just Bible and theology or what to believe or how to live. It's not just ethics. Those are both very important, but it's also how you live. It's a way of life, and that's the only way to make sense of so much of the Gospels.
I mean, one key part of that is Sabbath.
Yes,
so
very key.
The idea of having a day of rest, it's there right from the beginning of Scripture.
It's all over the life of Jesus.
Something Jesus would have done. Something we've kind of, I think the modern church has in some way said, well, it's rather legalistic now to keep the Sabbath. But you're a big fan of the Sabbath, and you've taken it very seriously and quite literally. You guys switch off on your Sabbath day, don't you?
Like technology. Yes, everything goes off. Friday night, it's 6 p.m. Yes, everything. It's done. We're 24 hours free. It's lovely.
And what difference did that make when you started doing that with your family?
Oh, a major one. And again, that's not like a biblical theology. The Bible doesn't say anything about iPhones. It says a lot about attention, and a lot about what we give our attention to is the person we become, which is where theology and neuroscience are in complete agreement right now. But that, we moved into Sabbath slow because, again, in the church tradition I came up with, that wasn't really on the radar. Well, I say that wasn't on the radar. We never would have used the language of Sabbath. We would have thought of it as a Jewish thing or an odd fringe thing. But most Protestant Christians and Catholics all had a category for what, most would have called the Lord's Day. Yes. Many would have called Sabbath, Wilberforce and others. Like, there's a strong tradition in the West of Sabbath, but often was just called the Lord's Day, which meant something until the 1960s or 70s. Like, my dad, who's, is 30 years older than me, so he's 69 years old. He grew up where I was born and raised in the Bay Area of what's now Silicon Valley. Nobody called it Silicon Valley in the 1950s. And he tells me stories about Sunday where the entire city shut down, nothing was open, everybody went to church. You were either Protestant, Catholic, or neither, and you went to a mainline church. And his family was kind of in this all, no faith in God, no understanding of Jesus, but they would still go to church. And then the rest of the day, you'd eat lunch, you'd hang out, if you were super progressive, you'd go to the park and play baseball. And he tells me about what a big deal it was when 7-Eleven came to town, and now there was something that was open on a Sunday. And so I think it's easy for us to forget. Andrew Sullivan's done some great work in his article, I Used to Be a Human Being, for The Atlantic, which is worth 15 minutes of your time to read. It's fascinating on kind of the death of the Sabbath in Western culture, because even if you were not religious, the Sabbath was still built into the cultural architecture. It was literally, in my country at least, I don't know about here, but it was in the legal code. There are blue laws, and it's illegal to open a business. It's certainly dissipated now to the extent that,
Sunday is very little difference in practical terms to any other day.
No, it's no different than Saturday. It's shopping, and maybe a little quieter in the morning, but
and it's gone in lockstep with obviously the march of technology, which means even those times when we could switch off from the office, you can't necessarily now, because there's an expectation
the office follows
you'll always be connected
everywhere your phone goes,
and everything else. We're hitting our first break already here, right? But I'm going to come back to Rachel in just a moment's time as we continue this conversation shortly on the ruthless elimination of hurry. My guests are John Mark Comer and Rachel Holmes. This is Unbelievable, bringing you an episode looking at the hurry-sick, anxiety-prone, tech-addicted nature of modern culture and what can we do about it. Two different perspectives with me on the show today.
What I want to invite Roger to comment on is, why couldn't the mental realm include an infinite consciousness?
It's too much like us. It's too much like putting it like the Greek views of the gods in some sense. They were too much like us.
They were finite and contingent. Here we're talking about a metaphysically necessary source.
I admire this noble aspiration to find the highest possible ideal. It's almost as if you're proposing a new religion to meet this new challenge.
It's not a new religion. Yes. What it is something that sits in the same place. It addresses some of the same needs, but it is not founded on the same principle.
If the New Testament says that Jesus did X, Y, and Z, did he do it or not?
I don't think it's a story that's made by committee. Am I going to have a later literary genius who comes up with a great story like this? Or am I going to say, no, Jesus is the genius, and somehow that story has basically been preserved?
Welcome back to the show. We're talking about the ruthless elimination of hurry. That's the title of John Mark Comer's new book. It's all about the hurry-sick, anxiety-prone, tech-addicted nature of modern culture, and drawing on his own experience, he invites those who are unsatisfied with their life to get off the treadmill, rediscover the way of Jesus. He says it can have transformative effect. It's a challenging read, though. I've been reading it myself, and I think many of us are only just starting to realise, as we were saying, just how much things like smartphones have changed our life. And even before that, we weren't very good at stopping and praying. So it's even harder now. Rachel Holmes is also on the line as someone who was a Christian at one time, no longer, but says she's discovered ways in which she has found peace and calm in the midst of difficult life situations through Buddhist practices. Rachel, coming back to you, I suppose it's interesting to hear within the kind of path that you're now finding some help on this. would you say that before you adopted the Buddhist sort of way of doing the introspection and meditation and so on, that what difference has it made, I suppose? Would you say that your life is better on that basis, or not necessarily materially better, but you handle the situations that life throws at you better because of these practices and so on?
Yes, I would say that I handled them much better. Obviously, it's speculation because I don't know how I would have handled them had I not followed this path. But yes, I'm less flappable. Although, having said that, and I hope it's all right for me to mention this, Justin, I have ended up on antidepressants again because having got through the cancer a few months later, my partner and I separated, and I had to leave our home, and that was quite emotionally devastating after what I'd been through earlier in the year.
So sorry.
But even then, thank you, John Mark. It has still, I think, helped me. And I don't think it's reasonable to expect these practices to make you superhuman. I mean, there were times over Christmas where I would just sob over the washing up, but I was able to be with those feelings and have them, and at times they were overwhelming. But they will pass. These things are impermanent. They're not going to kill me however much they hurt. And I think that's something that the practices of mindfulness and other types of meditation have helped me learn. And I'm not going to lie, it's been really horrible, and I'm much more stable now. And how much of that is due to time, how much to my practice, and how much to SSRIs, I do not know. But I would say I think they have helped me to manage things better, but that doesn't make me superhuman.
No, and I'm sure you wouldn't want anyone to think that just use going into the practices in your book, John Mark, would necessarily create some smooth, calm, perfect life.
Buy my book, and you too can never be sad again.
I mean, it's interesting to hear how much overlap is there in your view, John Mark, between the practices that have helped Rachel and the ones that you're advocating, at the heart of which is, of course, prayer as well, which kind of is the centre point of many of the spiritual disciplines that you outline in the book that help us to order our lives in ways that stop the hurry and get us connected again with God. So where's the overlap?
Yeah, I mean, and again, I actually have great respect for a lot of Buddhism, and I think one of the reasons it's doing so well in Western culture is because it's really more psychology, in my understanding. Rachel, I'd love to have you speak to this, than it is spirituality. It's kind of religion without God, which works quite well, I think, in Western culture. And there's some obviously major differences, in particular around spirituality. The tradition that I'm a part of is first and foremost relational. And so that's missing, but there are some really profound similarities. And I think, in biblical theology, there's this idea of chokmah, or the word we translated wisdom. And in biblical theology, it's not just like, a pithy saying or street smarts. It's this idea that we've lost since the Enlightenment of moral knowledge and relational knowledge and theological knowledge. That just like we can have knowledge of the physical universe, the law of gravity or the laws of thermodynamics, you can have knowledge of the way that relationships work and interpersonal things work and generosity works. And so there's this tapping in, which is why the Proverbs are full of little aphorisms from all sorts of pagan cultures and non-Jewish cultures. There's this celebration of chokmah wherever you find it. And so I think that much of Buddhism is tapping into that chokmah, that wisdom, that reality at the center of the universe, not just at a physical level, but at a moral and an intellectual and an emotional and relational level. And I think one of the subtle but very similar things still, though different, is, obviously in Buddhism, there's so much talk about non-attachment and kind of coming to where your emotions, you're let them pass through you and come to where they no longer own you or control you. And there's a long-running tradition, kind of stream in the way of Jesus. Ignatius of Loyola is the founder of the Jesuit order. He is, kind of my favorite teacher on the subject. He called it, most people translate it indifference, but that's a weird English word, and the translation of Spanish, some argue a better word is freedom. The French mystics called it detachment. Christian psychologists often call it yieldedness. But there's this internal emotional place and mental place that you come to in prayer where you come to just kind of release the illusion of control. I read recently that the average Western person has 15% of the control over their life they think they do. Hence the neurosis all over Western culture. 15%, and so we rage and we manipulate and we bully other people and we endanger ourselves in an attempt to notch that 15% up. But best case scenario, we get to 17, 18.
I often feel personally when I pray, the main benefit very often is simply that for a little while I stop thinking about myself.
Yes.
And that's that kind of...
That is no small thing.
Yeah, exactly. And you realise how little you often do that most of the time.
And the freedom and the joy that comes through that,
So the natural question that maybe someone would have if they were sceptical would be, well, great. It sounds a bit like that aphorism that, we don't pray to change God, we pray to change us sort of thing.
Yeah, and that's not what I'm saying.
So what's the difference then between prayer as a sort of meditative, taking the focus off yourself kind of activity, which looks quite similar to a Buddhist kind of approach maybe, and what's specifically Christian, I suppose?
Yes.
What's the difference?
Well, I think, prayer is, people forget, is an incredibly broad spectrum of experience with God. So often, in particular, Protestant Christians will hear the word prayer and think of one type of prayer, which is asking God to do things in the world, which is a prayer that feels from the inside more like work. And I think it is at a theological level. I think prayer in that, if you want to call it intercessory prayer or just asking God for things, is kind of one theologian I love writes that prayer is a moral responsibility, meaning we actually partner with God and work with God through our own imagination and creativity and heart and generativity to see the world move forward toward shalom and human flourishing. But that doesn't mean that all prayer is asking God for things any more than all relationship between two partners or a father and a daughter or friends is all asking each other for things. That would be a really dysfunctional relationship. There's a type of prayer that feels far more like resting in God. And I think that, what we would call contemplative, that kind of contemplative tradition or meditation, which is in some ways very similar. You're quiet, you're alone, you're attempting to still your thoughts. In other ways, very different. I think maybe this is a gross oversimplification, and Rachel speak to this, but in my kind of understanding of the subject, the major difference between Christian and Hebrew meditation and Eastern meditation is the goal for us is less to empty our mind and more to fill our mind, and not just with ideas or images, but with a relational experience of
That's
God.
An interesting sort of way of distinguishing them. Yeah. When you, in the practices, the Eastern sort of Buddhist type practice that you undertake, Rachel, do you even talk of it as prayer? Is that a word you would use? Or would you say more meditation or something like that?
It isn't a word I use, but there are quite a lot of different Buddhist traditions, and some of which do sort of think of gods or devas, and they do pray. It's not part of my experience, and obviously there are many different types of meditation. I don't know whether it's so much about stilling the thoughts. Some types of it very much is about that, but it's kind of, even when you're doing that, it's to shut down the stories about what's happening and be with what actually is happening. Well
said.
So it isn't take me away into a trance, which is, I'm not saying that's what you said, John Mark. It's just I have found that kind of misunderstanding amongst some people.
Right. Yeah.
But
that's not my perception at all.
No. But you're quite right that it isn't relational. And actually, one of the things that separated off what's called the Mahayana school of Buddhism from the Theravada tradition was the Mahayana people said, well, it's all very well you sitting there wanting your own enlightenment, but what about the world? What about everyone else? And there's something within the Mahayana tradition called the Bodhisattva, which is I dedicate myself to the liberation of all beings. But even then, the meditation itself is not relational in the way that, for a Christian, prayer is.
Yes, and drawing.
So,
and art, because what Saint Teresa, 16th century Spanish mystic and just fierce woman. She called this type of prayer silent love. And, that's my favorite type of prayer. It's just sitting in the quiet before God in silent love, receiving love from God, giving love back to God. And really, my hope is that there's the pleasure of just that experience, the experience of love. But really, I think the end goal, the telos of the spiritual journey in Jesus' mind, as best I can tell, is to become the kind of person who is pervaded by love, not just compassion, but agape, as Jesus would define it, to will the good of another ahead of your own, no matter the cost to yourself. And as best I can understand, again, where biblical theology and neuroscience, I think, agree, based on my, of course, limited understanding, is that we become more loving by experiencing love, not just by hearing about it or reading a book about it or downloading a podcast. It's the experience of love through our family of origin or a lover or a friend, or for us, above all, God, that does something in the inner woman or man of us to make us into more loving people.
Just be interested in that sense then. Let's say I'm going to be the person to try and create a little bit of friction.
Finally,
here.
You're going to be the bad guy.
Trying to earn your paycheck.
Far too much agreement going on here. So
I can't get us to disagree about love and compassion.
But terrible things.
But if I could play devil's advocate here, then so if, say, Rachel's experience is having broadly the same effect as your experience as a Christian, John Mark, of contemplative prayer, someone might say, well, hey, does it matter then in the end? What's the difference? And I could imagine a skeptic even saying what you conceive to be a relationship with God, John Mark, is actually pretty well explained by the psychological impact of simply stopping, resting, and doing what Rachel does as well. Who I'm assuming, Rachel, you don't feel a need to have a supernatural dimension to what's happening there. You feel there's probably a kind of material, psychological kind of explanation going on.
I would say that, but I'd be interested to come back to that after John Mark has answered.
Okay, all right. Well, what difference then does it make whether you're doing it Rachel's way or your way, John Mark?
Well, I mean, that's a hypothetical scenario, and I have no way of measuring, which prayer is working better or which form of meditation is working better, and we're two different people and two different experiences. I also have no way of measuring, where God is involved in Rachel's life, and she's open to that possibility, But
because to saying that, I guess from your point of view, you wouldn't say that God is absent in the things that Rachel is doing. God's doing something, even if Rachel doesn't necessarily.
Are you trying to theologically trap me?
I'm not trying to trap you. No. I'm
no,
just saying,
I mean, and this is where
presumably all truth is God's truth in a sense that, if something good is happening, God's not somehow completely absent.
Yes, and we're so prone to the subject-object dissonance. You know what I mean? God is out there, we are here. When I have an inner feeling or thought in my mind, it's me, not God, or it's my brain or my nervous system or my memory or my limbic system, not God, as if, those two things have no interpenetration. And I will just plead the mystery of the universe, cop out card. And I am 100% orthodox and historic in my reading of the Bible and my trust in the New Testament. And so this isn't some kind of, hint or nod to a progressive, update of the New Testament or whatever. But in my best reading of the New Testament, I think you can hold to a historic Orthodox view of Jesus and the cross and the resurrection and atonement and still have wide space to celebrate a God who's so much broader than that tradition and who is by nature compassionate and is at work. And you see that from the very first pages of the Bible in the Melchizedek story. Who's not a Hebrew, you never read about him again. Where did this person come from? Who's in relationship with God, who's a mediator between God and people. And so I think, there's a celebration through the. I don't think it's not the main portrait. The Bible is told through the story of Israel. But outside of that tradition, without compromising any of my theological or doctrinal kind of convictions, I have no problem thinking that a compassionate God of love is loving Rachel as she's open to the possibility of his love, And so that's why it's just hard to measure. One, she's a different person than I am. Two, we all start from different places and different mental and emotional places. And three, who knows where this compassionate God of love is at work and we don't know it. I know there's all sorts of areas in my life where I think God is at work and I'm ignorant of it all the time.
I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth either at this point, Rachel, but I mean, I'd just be interested to know what you think from your perspective as someone who doesn't necessarily, believe in the supernatural, is actually happening in John Mark's experience when he has an experience of what he would call feeling the love of God and the way that changes his life and the way he lives and so on.
And I wouldn't just say feeling the love of God. I would say experiencing the love of God. Yeah, I'm actually a pretty cognitive person. I struggle to feel. I'm trying to get more in touch with my emotions. I think I would distinguish between just feeling and experiencing. Okay.
But what do you think's going on for you, Rachel, at that point? And how does it tally with the kind of experience you have when you slow down and meditate?
Well, I think, like John Mark, I would be very reluctant to say anything about what might be happening to him, for the same reasons he gave when speaking about me. But I don't know. It's when I sort of slow down and meditate, there can be very many things. Sometimes it can be very painful. Things will come up that are uncomfortable. I become, and this is something that John Mark actually mentions in his book, become aware of my dark side. The ugliness in my character, and other times I will be filled with a lightness and joy. It's these things just arise, and I do think it is psychological, but it's allowing me to tap into things that are much deeper than I would be able to touch into if I were just sort of scooting along without taking that time to be still and to be quiet. But the one thing I wanted to mention when you spoke to me before, Justin, was that I had very powerful emotional experiences when I was a Christian. I mean, I was a teenager in the 80s, and charismatic Christianity, as well as the sort of discipleship kind of thing, were going on. And during that period, my kidneys were getting worse. I was anticipated to have a transplant. And many, many people prayed for me. And obviously I didn't get healed, but I did have very powerful emotional experiences of release of what John Mark said and what I interpreted it as at the time, of being absolutely bathed in divine love. And it would be far too easy for me to reinterpret those experiences in light of what I now believe. But I do know they were very powerful, and they had transformative effect, whatever they were caused, whether it was by God or by something psychological. I would not discount the meaningfulness of those experiences.
I mean, it does lead me to the next natural question then, Rachel, if you don't mind me asking it, of why did you ultimately then abandon Christianity if you had quite powerful experiences within that? Obviously, you didn't see the healing you had hoped. Was that part of the reason why ultimately you left Christianity?
It was part of the reason. I mean, the reasons I'm now not a believer aren't the same as, well, not completely the same as the reasons I lost my faith initially. But yes, I mean, the not being healed was a very big thing. I mean, I remember very vividly the night I sort of woke up in the middle of the night, and it was just sort of, I don't believe anymore. Because I just had my second kidney transplant, and it looked like that was going to fail. And I just thought, if all these people have prayed and I've just continued to get worse, I've lost one transplant, it looks like I now may lose my second, then what does that mean about God? Does he exist? If he does exist, does he just not care? And I know you can pull apart these arguments, but that was kind of the sort of, it's sort of like something snapped in me. And I think I realized that what I had thought of as my faith by that point had become a sort of cognitive attachment. It had actually, the corpse was already there. I just, it's dead. I should probably get it out in the garden. So that was what initially did it. I mean, I've thought about and been through many phases in the interim. I went slightly bananas after I lost my faith because I didn't know right from wrong. The Bible had been the only metric by which I could judge it. Without that, it's like, I don't know. So yes, I had a wild phase, and then hopefully come back to something more sensible. But yeah, that was what initially triggered it.
Yeah.
But I've certainly gone from being wildly no, there is no God, to I don't think there is, but I am open to the mysteries of life.
Right. That's so helpful and very honest. Thank you,
Yeah,
Rachel,
thank you for that,
sharing.
Rachel. I'm so, gosh, I mean, the pain of the kidney thing, I mean, I can only imagine what that must have been like. I'd love to hear...
Go
Sorry,
ahead.
carry on.
No, I'd love to hear, you mentioned the reasons you're not a Christian now are different than the original ones. Can you explore that? I'd love to hear why.
I think at the time I find it hard to tally Christian belief with what I perceive as being the reality of the world. I find something as contradictory. But if you put me on the spot, I'm just going, oh God, I don't know. It's been a long time since I've really thought about these things.
God, sorry, not my intent.
Specifically. I mean, I've gone from being very angry to being much more reconciled with my past and the good things that I got from being a Christian, as well as the things that were painful. I still have a very complicated relationship with hope.
With hope,
hoping that my kid hope.
Right. Yeah.
Yes. But anyway, that's getting off track a bit.
Well, it's all relevant in some ways, and I appreciate you sort of humouring my question as to what it was that took you away in the end. And I suppose, I mean, it takes us on to a slightly different topic at this point, John Mark, but I guess as a pastor, you see people who have been in similar places to Rachel, who are in all kinds of different situations, and many of whom have experienced disappointments.
Yeah.
What do you find how causes people to either abandon the Christian way or stay in the Christian way? I don't know, what are the things ultimately that help people to see this as, even when things aren't getting healed and life isn't going the direction we might hope, that keep people actually believing in this as being the way that life ultimately can be lived and can be hopeful?
Yeah, I mean, I think out of honor for human dignity and individuality, I hesitate to put some kind of rubric over this is why people abandon the Christian faith, or here's who we blame, or it's rebellion, or it's this, or it's whatever. I think that is unkind and unwise, and I think every person has their own story. And what's intriguing about yours, Rachel, is that your loss of faith came as your kidney was failing. And you know what I mean? It wasn't just this cold-heartedness or some desire to just, abandon all ethics or whatever. It was a part of this intricate and tender kind of suffering. And I do know that, there's much, I think, bad thinking and bad theology in the Western Church around suffering and around pain. And I think there's a few things about the way the Western Church is set, and that's a broad overgeneralization that's almost unhelpful. And the Western Church it's low-hanging fruit to criticize because there's nobody there to defend it. And anything that any Christian has ever done wrong in the West, you can say, "See, they were a Christian," So if we applied that same rubric to democracy or whatever, I mean, you'd have far more fodder for critique. But I do think there are a few broad trends across traditions in the Western Church that set people up for a crisis of faith. And I think one of the major ones is theodicy, or just the academic language for the problem of evil. And different Christians have different answers to that. And you have these two, and I'd love to know what your church background was, Rachel. What kind of church tradition did you grow up in?
It was varied. It was partly Anglican, partly Methodist. And for a brief while, and I don't know if you remember this, Justin, I was a member of the 9 o'clock service in Sheffield, which collapsed in scandal.
Oh yes, I do. I remember that story.
Yeah.
Right, wow.
Yes.
Okay. But and there's obviously been a charismatic strain within that, you were saying. So that would that sort of been kind of John Wimber style sort of healing?
I went to 2 Wimber conferences in the 80s.
Wow.
Yeah.
And he was a lovely guy, actually. He was a very, very likable chap.
Yeah, and I'm a fan, 110%. But I think, not but, period. And I think the two theological strains that I would disagree with that aren't even necessarily what everybody believes, but is the popular perception or what's emotionally communicated to many people, is one, the idea that God's in control of everything that happens,
right.
which I think is one of the great heresies of the Western Church, and that's a genuine point of theological disagreement between what's called the Calvinist tradition and other traditions.
Interesting.
And two would be the kind of more charismatic stream that God always wants to heal, which I agree with, and therefore you just need enough faith, or you just need the right prayer formula, or you just need whatever.
I think thankfully I don't really ever took that one on board. I did hear if you don't get healed, it's because you don't have enough faith.
Right.
I don't think I ever really took that one on board.
You took that in.
I heard it, but I think I sort of emotionally rolled my eyes about it. I don't think that one ever really landed.
Yeah.
I was skeptical about it even when I was a Christian. So
but I think,
really what's the critical amount of faith
which is wise, and I would be skeptical too. Though I am charismatic is the insider lingo.
Yeah.
I think that the Spirit of Jesus heals people, and I think that what's God in control of, and how does human free will interact with God's presence in the universe is one of the great mysteries and great disagreements of the church in general, much less the Western church. But I do think that when we read the Gospels, we read about a Jesus who both healed the sick and then eventually died.
Yeah.
And the story ends with suffering, with the passion. And whatever the human experience is, it is going to involve a passion, a suffering, a dying. And so I think there's a meeting Jesus in that I think is tragic for many people. In my experience, have lost their faith, I think, because of some very unhelpful assumptions about the role of God and evil and suffering, and some that were handed to them, if not officially, maybe emotionally and relationally through the broader church culture.
We're going to go to a final break here, and then we'll have just a chance to wrap up the conversation. Been really enjoying today's one. Very, free-flowing, wide-ranging today between Rachel Holmes and John Mark Comer, talking about the ruthless elimination of hurry. I will make sure, of course, that there's links as well to where you can find out more about both my guests from today's show. PremierChristianRadio.com/unbelievable to find out more about the programme. Get hold of the podcast and get in touch as well. And we'll be back with the final part very shortly.
If you listen to Unbelievable with Justin Briley on Premier Christian Radio and enjoy the conversations between Christians and skeptics, then this is the perfect app for you. For the latest updates, podcasts, videos, articles, bonus content and much more, download the Premier Unbelievable app today.
What an interesting conversation we've had today. John Mark Comer and Rachel Holmes have joined me on the show. Rachel, an ex-Christian. She would say, though, she's been on an interesting journey that led her to Buddhist practices ultimately. And funnily enough, Unbelievable was part of that journey en route. And John Mark Comer, who's been a long time Unbelievable listener, and we finally got him in studio to talk about his latest book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. As I said, do check the show page for more details about it, but it's available wherever you get books from. And Rachel, as much as obviously you said at the outset, look, I don't go with the Jesus stuff necessarily in the book, but I see a lot of commonalities with what I find helpful. I mean, you have found ultimately picking up the book, even as a non-Christian, has kind of sparked some interesting thoughts and helpful stuff in your own life?
It has, and it's made me consider certain things. And I did want to say to John Mark how much I admired your honesty, your humour and your authenticity, and you're willing to really take on these changes to become a more honest, committed apprentice of Jesus. Because I really admire your commitment to that, and that there are certain things in the book that I have been thinking about but haven't really done, and Sabbath is one of them. I'm self-employed, so I tend not to get a day off. It's very easy for me to go, oh, well, I'm self-employed, I can do this, that's billable. And I don't find it very helpful. Because I'm never getting time when there isn't that anxious little to-do list going in my head.
Rachel, have you either read the little book or seen the TED Talk by Pico Iyer, it's a fellow Brit, I believe, The Art of Stillness?
I haven't.
That's fascinating. He is a secular guy who does a tour of like Trappist abbeys and research around Thomas Merton and some Buddhists.
Oh, yeah.
And he makes a case for what he calls a secular Sabbath, which is basically saying, I'm not a Christian or a Jew, but I think we've lost something that we should not have lost. It's interesting
Yeah.
That is really interesting.
Yeah.
I haven't got a pen, otherwise I'd write that down. So
show notes, right?
We'll put it in the show notes. Yeah, absolutely. I'm pleased that you have found the book helpful at some level, because it was always a bit of I didn't quite know how this show was going to turn out, quite honestly, Rachel, but you've been such a great guest and so willing to engage and be very honest with your story, and I truly appreciate that. I suppose that the question that I've got, and forgive me if it's uncomfortable anyway, but is, given where you are now, could you ever conceive that Christianity might be a path you could find your way back to again, or do you think that that road has been walked and it's probably not ever really gonna happen again?
It's hard for me to imagine it happening, but if you'd asked me 20 years ago whether I'd be a Buddhist, I would have what? So I simply don't know what is in the future.
It's not something you're completely closed off to. It sounds like you're not saying that could never ever happen to me, I'm afraid.
I'm not closed off to it, but I find it very hard to imagine that it would happen.
Yeah. I mean, and for you, John Mark, you probably, when you wrote this book, as I say, were primarily thinking of people who are Christians and are apprentices, as you call it, of Jesus in the book, and it's written with that in mind. What about the people who are listening, who are sort of interested in this Jesus way but not convinced about it? Does simply doing the practice help at some level? I mean, does kind of just trying out, if you like, because that was kind of what I was trying with Rachel when she first came on the show.
Yeah,
let's just see what happens when you try praying. What actually would happen if you? And interestingly, although the vast majority of people said, I found it helpful in a kind of, it settled me down, but I don't think I heard God speaking to me. Some people became Christians through it. A couple of people did. And that was quite, for me, I wasn't even really expecting that. Maybe that shows my level of faith. But what's your kind of, where for you is there a value even in the Jesus thing for those who wouldn't necessarily call themselves Jesus followers in that way?
Yes and no. One of Jesus' most famous teachings is, you shall know the truth and it shall set you free. And beautiful idea. A mentor of mine once said to me, as I was just exploring, what do I actually believe? He said, I think Jesus would be the kind of person who would tell you, you must follow the truth wherever it leads. And I like that idea. And so I think what I hear in Rachel's voice and what I want to engender in my own heart is just an openness to truth, to reality, to what is. And my understanding, my experience, my trust is that at the center of what is a Trinitarian community of love and joy and peace that I want to open to. And so I think the practices of Jesus are not just meditative techniques. In the rubric of the way of Jesus, the goal isn't actually to calm down and to settle your mind and to chill out or even to be happier or nicer. It's all a means to an end. It's to open yourself at a relational level to God, to this Trinitarian community of love, and through Jesus and the Spirit experience His love and have God transform you into a person of love for the world as you live in relational connection with God Himself. Jesus' famous teaching on this was abiding in the vine, which is Christian language. It sounds weird to a Western ear, but it's one of the most important teachings of Jesus. And it's a word picture for this kind of relational resting in God as we live all through the day, and out of that bear fruit, in Jesus' kind of agrarian analogy. So I think yes in that. I think no in that we don't do these practices just for the benefit. Just for the benefit and just to feel better, and they're not an end of themselves. It's not like...
This isn't just a self-help book.
No, this is not... Yeah, there's self-improvement. I have no problem with self-improvement, but this is not self-improvement for Jesus or Christian self-help. These are relational practices. They are, I have a practice of date night with my wife, and the goal is not just to have date night or to feel good or to check the box. It's to relationally connect with my wife. And so the goal for a Christian of Sabbath, of silence and solitude, of slowing, is not just to do these things and feel better. And it's actually to relationally connect with God. But here's what I love. I just think that Jesus is true. And I think that the way of Jesus is the best possible way to live. So I think anybody, whether they're hostile to the idea of Jesus or open and warm and kind, like Rachel is, I think try it on. Try the way of Jesus on from the inside out. Try ethically living into his way. Try spiritually living into, like, opening yourself to God and asking for God to reveal himself to you and pervade you with his divine love, as Rachel said. And so I definitely think that you can hold the way of Jesus up against any other tradition, any other religion, any other secular or psychological framework, and I think you will not only find it compares, I think you will find it as the best possible way to be human. Now, obviously, I'm 100% biased, right? And like all the way in. Yeah. But I really think that you can try on the way of Jesus from the inside, and it will. I think it will prove true.
Rachel, I've really appreciated you coming on to talk this through with John Mark.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's been real fun. So thank you so much. John Mark, thank you for stopping by the studio.
Such a joy.
It's been great. I'm glad we've been able
Rachel,
to connect.
And Rachel, it's such a joy to kind of meet you, not really meet you.
Likewise.
I still don't know what you look like, but you're lovely to chat to.
You too. It's been a pleasure to read your book.
Great. Well, thank you guys both for being with me. Do check out The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry as well. Make sure there are links from today's show. But for the moment, John Mark and Rachel, thanks for being with me.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.